U.S. Matters post-election forum. Tonight we're going to take a look back at the election. It seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? It's only over a week ago. We're going to look back at the 2014 election and try to analyze what happened with our panel today. And then we're going to look forward to see what the implications of the elections are. And of course, since we have two panelists from Iowa, we got to start talking about the next election. I know a lot of you don't want to hear that after all the negative ads, but we're going to take a sneak peek into Iowa 2016. It's an open race for president, and it ought to be exciting and competitive, and we'll take a look ahead. So tonight, joining me on our panel today, to my far right, we've got the two Illinoisans on one side and the two Iowans on the other. Brad McMillan. Brad's the director of the Center for Principal Leadership at Bradley University. And he was former aide to Congressman Ray LaHood, who was a Republican congressman who served President Obama as Transportation Secretary. And Brad was involved in the Illinois Reform Commission. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to clean up this process at the end of the evening tonight. This is Bernie Schoenberg. We're very pleased to have Bernie here. He's been to our campus before. How many years ago?
About 40.
40 years. He played soccer and scored a goal against us. So,
one of the few.
Bernie's the political reporter and columnist for the Springfield Journal-Register, and has been following everything about Springfield politics for a lot of years. So he'll be talking a little bit from the Illinois angle. To my far left is Ed Tibbetts, who's the political reporter for the Quad City Times. He's been covering elections on both sides of the river, mostly focusing on Iowa, including the Iowa caucuses for about 25 years?
Something like that.
Okay, all right. And to my left here is Chris Larimer. We're happy to have Chris here. He's a political science professor from Northern Iowa University, and he's also a regular guest if you ever watch Iowa Press on the PBS station. He's a regular guest there. That's our panel. What we're going to do is talk about these issues, and then I'm hoping to open it up for questions later. And we'll have some questions from the audience. We'll take those a little later in the evening. So with the start, as everybody's aware, it was a big election. And the Republicans came out victorious across the country. Just today, I saw that where Nancy Pelosi, the House Minority Leader, said this wasn't a wave, it was more like an ebb tide. My reading of it was more like a tsunami for the Republicans. What do you think, Brad? How does that rate as far as a sea change in American politics?
Well, I think it was a huge sea change. I mean, picking up 8 U.S. Senate seats, 12 House seats. I think the House has historic Republican numbers. It's going to be very interesting, to see whether President Obama understands that he has to deal with Congress in a different way. Otherwise, I know we all feel that there already is a lot of gridlock and not a lot of things get done, but it could even get worse in my view. And I don't know if you saw, but they invited the Republican leaders to the White House, the Friday after the election, and immediately a fight broke out over the immigration issue. But it was a huge victory for the Republican Party. The only thing that I will add to it is that the voter turnout was the lowest since Hitler was in power and Mitch McConnell was 8 months old. And so that goes back quite a ways. So it wasn't like, while it was a huge change for the Republicans, it wasn't that many Americans actually voted.
I think in Illinois has been trending very blue in recent years as Democrats move out from the city of Chicago into the suburbs. So it was an interesting dichotomy in Illinois. Nationally, I think clearly it was a big Republican wave. One, Springfield result, Dick Durbin, the second most powerful right now person in the U.S. Senate, because he's on the Democratic side, which will seem to be the minority, lives in Springfield. He easily won re-election over Mr. Oberweis because the ice cream just couldn't go farther than it did. But so he will be in the minority, but he will still be on TV shows a lot, I'm sure, on Sunday mornings and be a spokesperson for things. And our governor's race, I don't think we had that kind of historic low in turnout in Illinois. I know, Sangamon County had like 53%. That's not too bad where Springfield is. Cook County was down from 4 years ago, I think 8 or 10%, which is probably one of the reasons that Bruce Rauner, our governor-elect, was able to win and bring that back to Republican hands after, I guess, 12 years. We have had back and forth governors in Illinois. We had 26 years of Republican governors, then we had a guy named Blagojevich who didn't help anything on the Democratic side, and then Quinn took over when he was impeached. And even though there was some recent economic gains nationally and in Illinois, 40,000 jobs created the past 2 months, people still feel, with their wages not going up generally, that the economy is sluggish, and Pat Quinn became kind of the punching bag for that, and Bruce Rauner spent $27 million of his own money, and his whole race was like 65, including the primary. So they really were able to pound home that message. My analysis after the election, with some help from smart people, was that people were just tired of Pat Quinn in Illinois. So the Republican wave helped some, but Bruce Rauner's campaign was very effectively run to try to get the message across that things are not good. And the legislature, there were veto-proof majorities that the Democrats held in both the House and the Senate remained. Mike Madigan, the Speaker of the Illinois House, had 71 members. He still has 71 members. And in the Senate, it was like 40 to 19 Democrats, which was the most Democrats of any Senate state Senate in the country, I believe. They lost just one seat. Mike Jacobs, is that the Quad Cities or Quincy? Quad Cities. And the Jacobs clan is now going to be out of power for the first time in a while because his father was a state senator for a long time, as Senator McMillan would remember. But they still have, 39 to 20. So Democrats remain significantly in control, other than the governor's mansion, which is going to be a big deal. And the big question now is, which part of Bruce Rauner's rhetoric will come true?
Chris?
I think from, I maybe have a little bit different take, but from a political science perspective, the election was, I guess I would call, predictably lopsided and really not all that abnormal. I know there was a lot of attention on it, but if you look at, every 2 years political scientists will put out what they call forecasting models saying here's what we expect to happen in the election. And they use what they call the fundamentals of the political system. And that's usually presidential approval, GDP growth in the second quarter of the year, so through June of the year or through July, and perceptions of the economy. What do people think the economy is on the right track or wrong track? And this year they had 6 different models. If you took the average of those models, those predicted that Republicans would pick up about 5 to 6 seats in the United States Senate, up to 8 seats potentially, and that on average Republicans would pick up about 14 seats in the U.S. House. Those predictions ended up being, remarkably close. And so I think given that it was a midterm election, given those kind of fundamentals and some of the indicators that we often use, this was not all that unusual. And those models are based on 3 or 4 variables. So it's a very simple model, but was able to get very close to what actually happened in the end. So in that sense, it wasn't all that unusual. I would say at the state level, it was more of a wave for Republicans. Prior to the 2010 election, Republicans controlled just 36 of the 98 state legislative chambers across the country. Since that time, they were able to get up to 59, or 58, and after this election, they're up to 69 of the 98 chambers are controlled by Republicans across the country. So Republicans are making significant gains at the state level. They can now control 31 governorships. So they're making big gains at the state level. They've made historic gains in 2010, and they did that again in 2014. But at the national level, given that turnout is what it is, in a midterm election, in Iowa, turnout actually went down 1.1 percentage points. So we had, roughly $80 to $90 million spent in Iowa on the U.S. Senate race. Ed and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. It's over $70 per vote, really is what the equivalent is there, and no effect on turnout. Turnout remained what it was in 2010. So I don't see it as all that unusual in terms of the fundamentals of the political system. I think what is unusual, or at least maybe disheartening for Democrats, is what's happening in states across the country in terms of Republicans continuing to make significant gains at the state level. Republicans now have unified control of state governments. They have both legislative chambers and the governor's office in 24 states. Democrats just have it in 7 states. So
I'm not sure that I can divine the difference between what is a tsunami or a wave or an ebb tide. And so I won't try to describe it in nautical terms, but in Iowa anyway, I think that the results showed a clear Republican victory at the federal level, but somewhat surprisingly, status quo at the state level. So you had a Senate race that was one of the most contested in the country, $90 million spent on it between Joni Ernst and Bruce Braley, that I think everybody, until the last weekend, thought was going to be a nail-biter. Turns out that Ernst won by 8.5 points. It was Iowa's first open Senate seat in 40 years, and a year in which Terry Branstad, probably Iowa's most successful politician in history, was on the ballot, and a midterm. And so I think that, as Chris mentions, it was a year that I think was primed to be a good year for Republicans. At the same time, you had a candidate in Joni Ernst who was not as well-known or as prepared at the federal level as her Democratic opponent, a 4-term congressman by the name of Bruce Braley. And yet, she came out the winner by 8.5 percentage points, which I don't think anybody predicted, except for the pollster for the Des Moines Register the weekend before the election, and that both campaigns, frankly, thought was over-optimistic towards the Republicans, and yet proved out to be true. In terms of the other congressional races in Iowa, there were 2 open seats. The Republicans won them both, and so now control 3 of the 4 congressional seats in Iowa, and both of the Senate seats. An extraordinary shift of power towards the Republicans in Iowa at the federal level. At the state level, Governor Branstad won a 6th term, unprecedented in U.S. history, and so obviously a very good night for him. But the state Senate, which had been controlled by the Democrats by a bare 2-point margin, 2-seat margin, 26 to 24, ended up staying that way. So to the extent that there was a wave or a tsunami, it missed the state Senate chamber, and now a lot of Democrats want to know what the Senate Democratic leader in Iowa, Mike Gronstal, knows that they might put to good use in 2016. There were also some statewide office holders, longtime office holders on the Democratic side that held their seats. And so while I think the marquee races, particularly the U.S. Senate race in Iowa, were clear victories for the Republicans, there were some results that the Democrats could take heart in Iowa, although I don't think at this point it's much consolation for them.
So Karl Rove predicted a permanent governing majority for the Republicans back when George W. Bush was president, and then when Obama was elected, there was talk of a permanent Democratic majority. His voters obviously weren't transferable in this election. What's going to happen? I mean, did the Republicans get a mandate here on issues, or was this just an anti-Obama vote? What do you see happening as far as issues of governing mandates here coming up?
You know, I guess my view is it was mostly an anti-Obama vote. I don't think it was that much issue-based, and you know, I know we're going to get into this, Robin, a little bit further down, but you know, I also think the way that the Republicans in most states controlled the map drawing process of the congressional districts, you know, had a significant impact in the way the election turned out as well. But you know, again, the voter turnout wasn't all that great, and you know, I didn't see, at least in Central Illinois, the Republican issues, you know, really come out very clearly or dominate the election. So I guess that's my 2 cents.
Okay.
I will say, I didn't mention in the first go-round, Republicans did pick up 2 congressional seats in Illinois, and I think Democrats still hold the majority, but one in Southern Illinois, one in Northern Illinois. So there were some gains there. I think a lot of it had to do with anti-Obama, and I think Illinois was less a place to use anti-Obama than some places because he's from there. He came into Chicago a few times to help try to jack up turnout. Obviously, it wasn't enough, and there was a fall off from 4 years ago. I do think, I don't know, I look back to about 92, I think it's about, and I don't mean to be partisan about this, but I think Rush Limbaugh kind of started something on the air. Everybody got a little meaner in public, although, I mean, historically in America, if you go through the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield, you'll see the Hall of Cartoons. People said really horrible things about Abraham Lincoln too. So there's always been this vitriol at election time. But in recent history, as I've been watching this, you know, Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, and MSNBC on the other side, you get this kind of personal attack thing that attacks people for what they look like and what they sound like and what they eat or whatever. And I do think the anti-Obama thing carried over across the nation. And he's not going to be on the ballot next time. It kind of depends who the Democrats get. Demographically, America is, you know, growing, and politically, I think has been, there is clearly a mix of views, and there's a very strong, you know, let's stop government intrusion in our lives movement, and there's also a very strong, you know, let's help folks. The whole Obamacare thing, for example, in Central Illinois, you know, it was downplayed. One of the congresspeople who was in a split district, Rodney Davis, in the 13th, you know, he kept saying repeal and replace Obamacare. I don't think it was a strong issue, but the Democrat in that race, Ann Callis, hardly mentioned that at all and was trying to avoid it, and mostly talked about how her son is an Army Ranger. And, you know, the anti-Obamacare guy won, but I'm not sure that he could have done that solely on that issue in Illinois at this time.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that presidential approval mattered. Certainly when you look at what predicts how people are going to vote for United States Senate or United States House, presidential approval is a significant factor there. So the fact that Obama was so disapproved of, particularly in Iowa, where his approval ratings were less than 40%, I think that did matter. But I also think if you look at it, you know, this electorate was not any different than 2010. Democrats made a lot of noise about trying to change the electorate, trying to get out non-2010 voters out for this election cycle, and they simply didn't do that. They did not change the electorate, and so as a result, you know, we really shouldn't have expected anything different in 2014. They were not able to get their advantage in terms of early votes, absentee votes, at least in Iowa as I looked at the numbers. So they didn't change the electorate, so we shouldn't have expected a change in the outcome. Along with that, I think there is a bit of a, at least in the United States Senate race in Iowa, there's a relatability issue. I mean, it did seem in that last poll that Iowa voters did seem to relate better to Joni Ernst, who won, the Republican candidate, more so than Bruce Braley, even though they thought Braley maybe had more depth on the issues. Just as an example, you know, in Iowa, the turnout was down, and it was about 70% of what it was in 2012. If it had been up to 80% of what it was in 2012, which means about 152,000 more votes, and Braley had won 75% of those votes, he still would have lost the election by about 18,000 votes. So it wasn't just that they didn't have turnout. They clearly had a problem with messaging. They clearly had a problem in terms of relating to regular voters.
You know, I think Chris makes a good point. Democrats had based a lot of their electability in 2014 on expanding the electorate. There was 15,000 fewer votes, I think it was, in 2014 than 2010, so it clearly didn't work. And yes, I would agree that President Obama was a drag on some candidates, but some more than others. And in some cases, it didn't seem to make a difference. I'll point to Dave Loebsack in Iowa's Central 2nd District. He ended up winning. He voted for the Affordable Care Act, and his opponent made that a big issue. He still ended up winning. Yes, it's a Democratic district, but he overperformed Bruce Braley, and so I think that some candidates, despite President Obama's negative impact on Democrats in the election, were able to overcome it.
So my question to the audience is, how many of you are sad to see all the negative ads in? Anybody? Or you're happy to see the negative ads in? I get asked this all the time. Why do campaigns run these ads? And I got to admit, I got tired of them. But we got 4 experts here that are gonna tell you why they run these ads, and hopefully shine a little light on this so you'll understand better. There you go, Brad.
Thanks, Robin. You know, I actually have somewhat of a contrary view on this. I actually, I mean, I think what the negative ads result in is the depressed voter turnout. And I do think we were talking at PD's before here that the negative ads probably do energize the base of both political parties. So it does get those narrow groups more fired up and get them out. But, you know, and I actually, you know, at least in central Illinois, I felt that, I mean, obviously the governor's race was the worst ever as far as negative ads, but the congressional race between Sherry Bustos and Bobby Schilling wasn't as negative. I'd say 2/3 of Sherry's commercials were positive. I mean, there were some negative. You know, and it was, I mean, in an otherwise Republican year, you know, Bustos winning by 10 points. I mean, it is a Democrat-leaning district. You know, I think her positive message mostly focused on creating jobs and veterans and constituent service and those kinds of things. I think played well. I mean, one of my passions is I wish we had more engaged citizens and we had much higher voter turnouts. I think if we did, the negative ads would have less of an impact.
I think clearly it depends. I agree with the consultants, unfortunately, that negative ads seem to work. It's just like everybody notice that there's feature stories all throughout the paper every day, but you notice the negative ones that put somebody down or raise a controversy. So I think the ads are like that. It was interesting that it just seemed in the governor's race, which is the big money, and Rauner had more money. But Quinn had a lot of money, so the message was able to get through. Rauner's message was Quinn's government is a failure, the state is a failure, and you can do better. And people did seem to let that resonate with them. Quinn's message was pretty much from the beginning, we need to raise the minimum wage, and Bruce has a lot of money and puts it in the Cayman Islands and was very bad in operating his businesses and was sued many times for terrible things. And all of that was pretty effective, except it seems like the voters cared more about how their government was operating than whatever Bruce did in the business world. I will say we didn't have the luxury of a congressional race without negatives. The Rodney Davis-Ann Callis race in the 13th, which was considered a swing race, at least at the beginning, before it became clear Callis was not that great on her feet dealing with issues as people thought she would have been after being a judge for 18 years in Southern Illinois. But there were a couple of news stories written early on. You know, her new husband in 2002 has a home in Missouri when she was a judge in Illinois, and she signed like a quitclaim deed which had a Missouri address. So somebody wrote an article. She signed a document as a judge saying that she was a Missouri resident. Well, the Rodney Davis people, you know, they didn't really need to do this the way the vote turned out, but, you know, she didn't know where she lived and was running all these terrible ads about Ann Callis has a housing problem. It was a bogus issue. I mean, at the same time, the Democrats were running this horribly bogus thing from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee that Rodney Davis, you know, voted for first-class flights for members of Congress like him, and they kept having some actor that looked like Rodney Davis on an airplane, you know, drinking wine, which was insane because he never takes a first-class flight and he sleeps in his office when he's in Washington. But, you know, he just attacked the heck out of her for not knowing where she lived and for having some cases overturned. And the ads actually said at the end she was a bad judge, she'd be a worse member of Congress. So when I was at a debate and one of the moderators, I said to each of them, would you really say this to this person right here? And neither of them actually did. What Rodney Davis said was, well, you know, the record is open season and they attacked my record. You know, people are not this mean, but their consultants make them this mean, and it's just a shame, and unfortunately, I still think it kind of works. Because a lot of people ask me, that Ann Callis, where does she really live? Doesn't she know?
Well, you know, political scientists have been looking at this for a while, at least in terms of turnout. And initially, the initial findings were that, yes, it motivated a partisan group of the electorate, that it would get the strong partisans out. But since then, there have been studies showing that negative ads really don't affect turnout, that they really don't mobilize anybody. So the evidence on turnout is surprisingly somewhat mixed in terms of a negative ad getting someone out to vote. In terms of the persuasive element there, I think, you know, that's partly mixed too, because as a voter, I mean, and really just as a human being, when you're watching something, you tend to, you know, watch something you agree with, and something that you don't agree with, you tend to ignore. And voters do the same thing, right? When they see a negative ad about their own candidate, they tend to ignore it. They only pick up on the information that agrees with their existing beliefs. So, you know, I'm not sure there was a big persuasive element there. But, you know, on the other hand, it's not surprising that campaigns use them, because, you know, basic psychology is that, you know, we remember things that scare us. We remember things that are negative more so than we do positive, because that affects our existence more so than positive information. So it's not surprising that campaigns use them. They're going to continue to use them because it's a way to try to create fear. But as far as the persuasive element, I'm not sure that there's a big effect there, because if you look at the electorate and you really try to narrow down who's an actual undecided voter, someone who doesn't lean one way or the other, you're talking about 5 to maybe 7% of the electorate. So the effect there is going to be pretty small and pretty marginal in terms of changing the outcome of the race.
I guess the only thing I would add is, in terms of persuasiveness, the two ads that probably on the right in the Senate race got the most resonance, got the most airplay, was an ad that highlighted Bruce Braley's comment about Chuck Grassley and Iowa farmers. And then there was an ad that talked about him missing 75% of VA committee meetings when he sat on the VA committee in the U.S. House. And those ads ran almost in a constant loop in Iowa. And the last Des Moines Register poll before the election, there was a question asked, essentially, what do you think the biggest mistake was that the candidate made, whether it was Ernst or Braley? And when it came to Braley, I think more than half, I don't remember the exact number, 57% sticks in my mind, said that his comment about Chuck Grassley was his biggest mistake. So, you know, whether that was something that occurred because of all the ads that were running that highlighted that, or would have occurred simply because of the news coverage of it, I'm not really sure. But I gotta believe that it had some impact. As for turnout, you know, I'm not really sure whether it depresses turnout or raises turnout. I do think, as we talked about earlier, that if it's an ad aimed at, say, Bruce Braley, and it's negative, it's going to fire up a person on the right and make them more likely to come out and A, vote, B, volunteer. And both of those things obviously have value for a campaign.
It just seems ironic, this year we had record spending in Illinois and Iowa, correct? Record spending nationally, and yet voter turnout declined from 41 to 36%. And the negative ads just keep on coming, and you had the impact of these super PACs, which were allowed in the Supreme Court decision of Citizens United. You've got a Supreme Court now that seems inclined to strike down any type of regulation on campaign spending and donations. Where's this heading if that continues on that trend? It doesn't sound good for people in our audience that hate these negative ads, even though there's some indications that they work. But where's this all heading as far as what your concern is, Brad, for an active and informed citizenry and just unlimited spending coming from both the left and the right?
Well, the thing that drives me nuts about the super PACs is that, you know, they don't have to disclose their donors, and so everything is non-transparent and it's all hidden, and almost, you know, 100% of the time, you can count on super PAC ads to be the most negative, the harshest ads out there. And, you know, so you know, when the United States Supreme Court, you know, comes down with a decision like Citizens United, I mean, that really does have a huge impact. And unless, you know, somewhere down the road, that decision gets modified or changed, it's opened up, you know, a Pandora's box as far as these outside groups being able to come in and influence these elections. And again, the thing that drives me the most nuts about it is the fact that there's no list of donors as to where the money's coming from.
Yeah, I don't see any significant change either unless, something unfortunate happens with a Supreme Court justice and a Democratic president, for example, would name somebody to the court that might lead to a reversal of that opinion. It is interesting over time. I've watched a lot of campaign reform ideas get passed, and Illinois, even after Blagojevich, now has limits on campaign spending, which of course in the governor's race got completely blown because once one candidate gives $250,000 to his own campaign, as Bruce Rauner did early, that blows the caps for the entire field. So that was gone. Jim Edgar, known as a good government type, always said, people will always, if you have caps, people will always find other ways to get the money to your election, which seems to be true. He did say, however, that disclosure was the best way to deal with this, which state law has provided for in state races. But as Brad just said, if you have the dark money happening and you don't know where it's coming from, it's more difficult. And I'm not sure if that changes without a reconfigured Supreme Court at some point.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's going to continue. Whether or not there's an actual effect, I think that remains to be determined. I mean, you look at, we had 2012, which was about a $6 billion presidential campaign, and I think 2 or 3 states changed on the Electoral College map. We had a $4 billion campaign in this midterm election, and we had lower turnout, and things really go as planned in terms of what people thought was going to happen in terms of the pickup for Republicans. But I think they're going to continue to do it. I mean, there seems to be that campaigns are willing to spend a lot of money to preserve the status quo, and I don't see any reason that trend will reverse, even though it won't result in a lot of big changes.
Yeah, I'll just make it unanimous and say that, yeah, I think it'll continue, but I don't think that it necessarily dooms us to a smaller electorate. I think the greater fault there is our campaigns that aren't motivating a broad swath of the electorate that doesn't believe, or that does believe that campaigns just don't speak to their needs. I think that's completely separate from this whole business of nasty ads.
Well, I've got a question to follow up on that. What, realistically, is there any chance of any types of reforms in Illinois, Iowa, or nationally that could help make campaigns more uplifting, or is that just a false hope at this point? Brad was involved in the Illinois Reform Commission, which tried to change the way districts are drawn in Illinois, and came up short. Are you going to take another whack at that, Brad? Or?
Yeah, actually, first it was the Fair Map Amendment in 2009, and then it was the ESPRINT maps that we ended up going down to Springfield with 530,000 signatures. We needed 292,000, but Speaker Madigan, challenged us not only on the petition signatures, but then a court ruled that one of the provisions in our amendment went beyond the proper scope. And I'm a lawyer, actually, and I agreed with the court. I tried to talk the powers that be not to include the provision that the court struck down, but I lost that battle. So we will rewrite the amendment. We had a statewide conference call today. I do think that it took 6 tries in California to get redistricting reform. So this would just be our 3rd try. We raised a lot of money for a reform effort. I think we raised somewhere between $4 and $5 million. But at the end of the day, we ran out of money when Madigan was bringing all the high-powered challenges to us. So we learned a lot of lessons, and we know that we're going to have to raise even more money, and we're going to have a bunch of it still sitting there when all these challenges come at us. But I do think we're going to get it done, and I do believe that, the big picture on redistricting reform is you'll end up with more competitive, evenly balanced districts. And what will happen is you'll end up having people wanting to get into the political ring because they won't feel like the deck's already been completely stacked against them. If the districts are more balanced, the candidates are not going to just be able to play to their party base to be able to win re-election. So it'll bring more accountability to the process. So we're not going to give up the fight. It's likely that we're going to relaunch for 2016.
Well, that was news. I didn't know that. Good luck. I'll believe it when I see it, that Illinois does this, because, you know, oftentimes when, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea, and I learned more about that issue this year when I went to a seminar that Mr. Colin, if that's how you pronounce his name? Collins, who was kind of the manager of this, was talking to a group about this in Springfield, and that's the first time I took a good look at the amendment that I hadn't written about, and it was a full page long. It was very complicated, and that's obviously what a little part of that tripped it up, because it limited anybody on the commission from serving in the legislature, and that limits who can run for the legislature in the court. Abner Mikva's daughter said that that's not legal, a Cook County judge. So we'll see if that ever happens. It is funny that over time, one of the big reforms that happened in the past was the cutback amendment. A guy named Pat Quinn engineered in 1980 to reduce the size of the Illinois House from 177 to 118 members. And that was because of anger over a 1978 pay raise that all happened in a day, 40% pay raise that raised legislators to $28,000 a year from 20. And the cutback amendment, we used to have every Senate district had 3 House members elected from the same district, and there were at least no more than 2 from one party. So everybody in Illinois, you know, unless there was the occasional independent elected, would have, if you're a Democrat, there was a Democrat in your district. If there was you're a Republican, you could go to a Republican in your district for representation. That was thrown out, and as a reform, and many people think that it is because of that that we have so much leadership, strengthening of leadership, because there's only 1 member per district, and somebody like Madigan can do like what he did in one of the districts, including Springfield this last year, spend about $700,000 to make sure that, you know, one of your freshmen stays there, and you don't get the diversity of opinion within a district because everybody is dependent on the leaders for that money. So I'm not saying we should go back to 3-member districts, although people, including Jim Edgar, think we should. And it's really hard to say how you change that structure, but I am always looking for the next race to be more uplifted.
Now, Iowa has a bipartisan commission draw its district lines, so they've got that reform in place. In fact, Illinois was using Iowa as kind of a model. Again, realistically, are there other reforms to help, again, uplift the campaign process other than that you see might come on the horizon in reaction to the campaigns we've just had?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, as you said, Iowa has a nonpartisan agency, the Legislative Services Agency, that draws the district lines in Iowa. The legislators just have to vote it up or down. They get to do that the first 2 times. Only on the 3rd plan can they amend the plan, but even then it's pretty limited. But it took Iowa a while to get to that point. It took them about 20 years from the 1950s through the 1970s to get to that point to get a nonpartisan commission. So it's a slow process, I mean, as you know. But I think in Iowa, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a push for more, at least, transparency on where donations are coming from. I think that's a possible reform. Another potential reform, and this would be just sort of a trickle down from these last 2 election cycles, but I think Iowa is one of just 11 states that has unlimited contributions for individuals that can make it to state level candidates. So you can give unlimited contributions to state legislative candidates. And Iowa is just one of 11 states that does that. I think if there's any sort of backlash or outcry from these last 2 elections, it may be that, hey, we need to try to rein in some of this money, or at least control it a little bit. We can either be transparent, or maybe we can put limits on contributions to state level candidates. But beyond that, I'm not sure there would be much in the way of reform, because I do think redistricting matters. I mean, the projections I've seen have said that Republicans could control the U.S. House through 2020 or even 2024 because of redistricting, essentially.
In terms of campaign finance, I don't think the outlook is probably very good for any major reform legislation. If you think about the last major one that passed, it was McCain-Feingold in 2002, I believe. And back then, the phrase "sunshine is the best disinfectant" was fairly in vogue, and now there are some quarters that think that sunshine is a threat to democracy. And so you know, where I think Chris is probably right, the best chance stands, the best chance of reform probably is in the area of not so much limiting how much people spend or give, but in making that more transparent. I think even that's going to be difficult.
Okay, I got a question here for the two panelists from Illinois. All eyes are on Bruce Rauner right now, the governor-elect, first Republican governor in 12 years, correct? The big question I've had talking to different people is, what will be his approach to governing? Will it be an approach like former Governor Jim Thompson had, a very bipartisan approach, compromise and getting things done, or will he take an approach of a governor like Scott Walker up in Wisconsin, which will be a more ideological approach? What's your prediction, Brad? Vern?
Well, you know, I just think Rauner his leadership style is completely unknown. And so there is no track record to, and I'm not saying that as a criticism to him, it's just that you don't know. Now, I will say this, me being from Peoria, you know, on his transition team, looking at, you know, how he's going to put together his new cabinet. He put on Doug Oberhelman, CEO of Caterpillar, and Aaron Schock, our local congressman. That gives me some encouragement that he's, you know, tapping into some pretty sharp people to give him some advice. But you know, you got to realize, and this kind of gets back to the redistricting thing. I mean, the number one priority issue for Speaker Mike Madigan was to stop redistricting reform. Make no mistake about it. And he was able to maintain his supermajorities in both the House and the Senate. Okay, so Governor Rauner has to assume the governorship with supermajority Democrats and veto-proof in both the House and the Senate. So it's going to be tough for him to be able to govern. And but I don't know whether I mean, you see where he's talking about setting up meetings with Cullerton and Madigan. You know, if he's going to get things done and be effective, he's going to have to figure out how to work constructively with the Democrat majority.
Agreed. To bring a little Iowa into this, David Yepsen, who used to be with the Des Moines Register, is at the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. I talked to him after the election. He said he assumes that Madigan, Cullerton, President of the Senate, Speaker of the House, and Bruce Rauner are all adults, and they will actually come together and work compromises, because in their own fields they wouldn't be where they are if they didn't compromise. That was, I thought, a very positive, optimistic view. We'll see how that goes. As far as Bruce Rauner's style and who he is and what he does, there was a great Chicago Magazine article written by Carol Felsenthal, freelance writer in Chicago, I think blogs for Chicago. He claimed that FDR said government unions are immoral and shouldn't exist, which the FDR library says that's not exactly what was said. It was really about strikes. He talked about government unions and named the leaders of the state teachers unions as the problem with state government. Okay, then he won the primary, and all of that talk stopped. Government union bosses fell out of his lexicon, if that's the right word, professors. And he talked much more about, you know, I'm going to work bipartisan, and it was really about Pat Quinn's a failure and I'm going to be fine. Then he won the election, and starting that night, he talked about Illinois is going to be competitive and compassionate. I had not heard the word compassionate until he won the election. So now he's talking about social programs, when his wife made a point to say he has no social agenda, which was one of the weirdest campaign promises or platforms I have ever heard. But clearly it worked, because what happened was he got elected in part because he was not Bill Brady, the conservative Republican 4 years ago, who scared women in the suburbs who may have voted Republican or were independent, but did not want their abortion rights cut into, as some governors have in some states. He cannot be Scott Walker because, as Brad said, he has an overly Democratic legislature. He talked about trying to be like Scott Walker. He talked about Scott Walker and Mitch Daniels from Indiana, the former governor there, a lot as role models for what he wanted to do, clearly seeming to talk about what happened with public employee unions. Now he has to deal with them, and we just have to wait and see, because there might yet be a fourth Bruce Rona.
Okay, my final question, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience to panelists from Iowa. One of the good parts about the recent campaign, I think good aspects, was you had a parade of presidential candidates coming through Iowa, campaigning for all kinds of candidates, the local candidates. Which, I'm going to put you on the spot, which candidates from either party serve themselves best as a prelude to the 2016 presidential election, which, by the way, the caucuses are only about 13 months away?
Not too far.
You saw them, you experienced them all coming through. Ed, you covered them. Chris, I know you followed them. Which candidates do you think came out? Did any come out ahead of the others for getting ready to run in Iowa?
You want to go first, or you want me?
Go for it.
Sure. Well, I think anybody who showed up in Iowa to help Joni Ernst helped themselves. Some maybe more than others. Marco Rubio was the first person and the only person in the primary to endorse her, and that will not be forgotten. I think Rand Paul helped himself by coming to the state often and doing the kinds of things that somebody who's running in 2016 needs to do to position themselves. I think Chris Christie certainly helped himself, and while he has some obstacles with Iowa voters, he came to help out Governor Branstad, and anytime you're on Governor Branstad's side in Iowa, that's going to help you with Republicans. On the Democratic side, you know, all the discussion centers on Hillary Clinton, and she was in the state, and I think that she was in the state enough for Bruce Braley, even though he lost, that Republicans, or rather Democrats, will not blame her or think that she didn't do enough. Early on, I think that there were folks who were questioning whether she was putting in enough effort. I think between her and former President Clinton, they came in a number of times late, and so I think they can credibly say to Iowa Democrats, we did our best to help.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree with that. And, you know, the big thing with Iowa is that you obviously have to, or at least caucus goers expect that personal connection with the candidate. And so while they may have come this last election cycle, they certainly need to keep coming if they want to maintain that connection. You know, on the Democratic side, as I said, you know, Hillary's the big name there. I think it's hard for other Democrats to break through. I mean, Governor Martin O'Malley from Maryland was around a bit, but people aren't all that familiar with him in Iowa, so he didn't get a lot of attention. On the Republican side, you know, I think you're seeing a lot of names bouncing around because they're trying to figure out, is there an electorate for themselves in Iowa? Because for the caucuses, you know, the caucus turnout and the Ames straw poll, which will be coming up, presumably, unless they cancel it in August of next year, attracts a different electorate than the general election. It's a more socially conservative electorate. So, you know, someone like a Chris Christie, and to some extent maybe even a Marco Rubio or Rand Paul, they're trying to figure out, you know, are they going to be able to get enough people out for caucus night to or maybe offset a more socially conservative candidate? If Mike Huckabee would run again, which I'm not sure if he would, or even a Rick Santorum, yeah. You know, those candidates have a core group of supporters because they have a core group of socially conservative voters who always show up on caucus night. The challenge is to try to make connections with other portions of the electorate so that they can do well on caucus night.
And it throws an even more uncertain cast upon it than Romney decides to.
Right, exactly.
Okay, let's we only got through about half the questions I had here, but are there any questions from the audience? We have some time. Steve?
You mentioned Rand Paul and Hillary in Iowa. There, on election night, there was a highly publicized thing out of the Rand Paul campaign called Hillary's Losers. Do you feel that it impacts her at all?
Well, I think probably it has a greater impact on him. I think Republicans in Iowa love it when one of their own goes after somebody on the opposite side. And so to the extent that Rand Paul is taking it to Hillary Clinton and doing it in a very public way, I think Republicans who will go to the caucuses love that sort of thing.
My question's for anyone. Now, before Obama took office, we saw a lot of young Democratic leaders willing to step up and run for president. And it seems that it's shifted over the years where we have the younger Republican candidates who are looking to take that presidential spot. What are the implications of the aging Democratic Party and the young Republican Party?
Chris, you want?
All right. Well, I think it's hard to speak to it in terms of specific individuals within the party. I mean, those things I think go in cycles. I think you can talk about it more generally within the electorate that Democrats they obviously have a difficulty attracting a different electorate in the midterm election. They just, for whatever reason, they cannot get younger voters excited about a midterm election. I think that's their really core problem. If they want to do well in a midterm, they need to. We know they do well with minority voters, younger voters, and particularly with single women. They were not able to get those groups out this last election cycle, and so if they don't do that again, if we get to 2018 and the same strategy again, they're just going to continue to lose seats over and over again. So I think it's more within the electorate. They have to reconfigure their message a little bit to get people keep that level of excitement going. Otherwise, I think we're just going to keep seeing this trend where they do well in a presidential election, but then there's always a huge drop off in the midterm.
I will just point out an interesting thing that I think Obama helped bring about, and I don't know if it's the electorate as opposed to candidates, but social media continues to grow and influence, all of us. I didn't have to tweet as a reporter a few years ago, and now everybody at my shop has to tweet at least twice a day. So we are there, and I'm old. But the Republicans tried really hard in Illinois this year to catch up to the Democrats, and the Democrats set the pace. The Obama campaign was the first. If you remember when the Joe Biden choice was coming out, everybody was supposed to get their phone number to the Obama people so that they could be texted who the choice was for vice president. I mean, that was brilliant in that it got names in a database. And it's the same thing Bruce Rauner did, for example, this year by collecting signatures, not necessarily from young people, but for his term limits statewide petition drive. They collected 600,000 signatures. That also was thrown out by the Supreme Court because it was drafted in the same way Pat Quinn's term limits drive in 1994 was drafted. So that made it clear it was going to be thrown out, but it got 600,000 names for the Republicans. So both sides are really pushing, and it's the social media that gets the young people involved, especially more so in a presidential race when everybody wants to go vote.
Yes, two for 2016. What is that election for president going to come down to getting out the vote, or is it going to come down to a particular message, a combination of both or something else? And just for fun, for 2016, who do you have getting the nominations and who do you have winning?
Good question for our four panelists.
Well, I guess I'll start. I think it's a fool's errand to try to predict what's going to happen in 4 years. I'm much better at telling you what happened yesterday than what will happen tomorrow. I can tell you what happened yesterday with pretty much 100% certainty. And I don't mean that to be a cop-out, but elections are so dependent on what happens or what's happening in the world. I know that I can tell you what we've seen in Iowa, which is in presidential elections, a lot of it has to do with winning in Iowa. Anyway, has to do with riding that base, really getting people not so much in the middle, but on your end of the spectrum, out to vote. President Obama proved it in 2008, 2012, and so I'll be very interested to see whether there's somebody who can replicate that in 2016, because Iowa has been a purple state, and sort of 2014 made it drift more towards the red. And right now what we're seeing are a greater number of Republican candidates to excite the Republican base in Iowa than we are Democratic candidates. It all sort of comes down to Hillary Clinton. As for who's going to win, I don't have that sort of guts.
I'll go out on a limb, and Hillary will win the Democratic nomination. You know, the Republican is just completely wide open right now. I mean, and it's just way too early. But my 2 cents on it is that if the Republicans want to have any chance in 2016, they're going to have to nominate somebody who is going to have independent crossover appeal. I mean, you always have a much higher voter turnout in a presidential election year, and you know, so I think the more electable Republican candidates probably are Jeb Bush or Chris Christie, and so I mean, but it's way too early.
So I believe money played a role in this election. What kind of role did Koch brothers' money play in this election? Does anybody have any idea about that?
The role of Koch brothers in this election. I don't have a lot. Truly, kind of in Illinois, labor unions donated a lot to the governor. Koch brothers are, I mean, what is it? Americans for Prosperity was actually started by the Koch brothers, so they played a role. There was a seminar. Americans for Prosperity had a luncheon just about 2 weeks before the election, and there was a woman, I can't remember her name, but she regularly appears on Fox News and also works for the Washington Times, I think, and was in Springfield and gave a very firebrand speech about these things. But there was such an avalanche of money from Rauner himself that in the governor's race it didn't make that much of a difference. In the congressional race that was very competitive in my area, both sides had adequate funding to get their message out many times over without it. So I didn't see, at least locally, or the things I was watching, that it was more than other things. And I will say that while everybody attacks the Koch brothers and the conservative money bundlers and all of that, the Democratic side has its share now too, because again, just like social media, the Republicans caught up. I think the Democrats are catching up with these outside groups and funding to try to even the playing field.
Is there an influence in Iowa?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, there certainly was. I mean, the Koch brothers were pouring in millions of dollars into the Senate race in Iowa. But the poll that Ed mentioned, as far as the biggest negative for Braley was the Grassley comment. The biggest negative for Joni Ernst was the influence of the Koch brothers' money. But she also won by 8.5 percentage points. So I mean, they were certainly a big presence in Iowa, but it didn't have that negative of an effect.
And I guess I would just add about the Iowa race. You had a trio of groups, Americans for Prosperity, Conserve Veterans. There was another one that had links to the Koch brothers. But on the other side of the fence, you had Next Gen Climate, Tom Steyer's group that was playing pretty heavily in Iowa. And he also donated to another group that played pretty heavily in Iowa. So
I would just throw in one thing that I just find interesting recently, and I'm not greatly knowledgeable about all of this, but I do notice that on the Sunday morning news shows there are now these ads for Koch Industries to put a softer face on them.
Right.
And it's like shocking that it took them 5 or 6 years of being bashed constantly by everybody to start doing this, because that probably has an effect too, and that's probably an effective use of their money.
Well, and if I might point out one other thing, the day after, not the day after the election, the week after the election, I got a release from Americans for Prosperity in Iowa talking about how their Iowa State Director had become the regional director. They've got a new Iowa State Director. And the message is, as we knew before the election, is that Americans for Prosperity is not going to be just an advertising vehicle in Iowa. They are a grassroots organization. And much like Organizing for America, President Obama's group after the 2008 election stayed in Iowa to prepare for 2012, Americans for Prosperity is a grassroots presence that's there to stay.
Thank you.
Tom.
It was a long time Iowa, growing up long enough. I remember Harold Hughes and Bob Ray and people like that. And Iowa was always fairly conservative. But just looking what's happening in the state, Tom Harkin, obviously one of the more liberal Democrats that they've had. We talk about a tsunami wave. And again, we know how much Joni Ernst won by, but how much do we see that as a major change within the state? Again, from that same area that elects Steve King, and we're supposedly, they were kind of beating down the Tea Party candidates nationally. I know the U.S. Chamber of Commerce were touting that they won 14 of the 15 states that they got actually involved in, yet Iowa was kind of a different bit of play there. You see Iowa changing that significantly as far as, we were saying that it's been kind of purple, but as your numbers in all the races, it seems to be increasingly red. That the impact of the way they redrew the districts, I know Ames came in with Steve King, and that didn't make any difference ultimately. Now, it may have been the candidate they ran and, what the message everything was, but is that the trend for Iowa now in the future, other than Loebsack winning in eastern Iowa? Is Iowa headed in that direction for the long term? And that really doesn't spell very well for Iowans. And, if Iowa's really a swing state, it may not be as much a swing state anymore.
Yeah, I think it's still a bit early to say. I mean, Iowa's gone for the Democratic presidential candidate, I think 5 of the last 6 presidential elections. And, the exception was 2004, and that was, I think, less than 10,000 votes was the difference there. So I'm not sure, obviously the members of Congress are red, but I'm not sure that the state as a whole is still not purple. I mean, Democratic Party registration has been going down, and, it has been since really 2009, 2010. But I still think, Iowa has 9 counties out of the 99 that have 50,000 or more active registered voters. And you can, and those are the urban areas. And a Democratic candidate should have an advantage in those areas. I think it was just this last election cycle, though the Democratic candidates did poorly in those urban areas. If they had done as well as they normally have done, I think we'd see a different set of results. So I think Democrats can do well in the state, and as the population becomes more concentrated in those 9 counties, I think Democrats can be competitive. It's just that this year, I think the congressional elections were nationalized in a way that maybe hasn't been in the past.
Well, and I would just add that one election does not a state color make. So, while one observer I talked to said Iowa is purple trending red, if you think that the big enchilada is the presidential election, we have a chance to figure out which color Iowa will be in 2016. I think the challenge for Democrats is you've got Tom Harkin leaving the stage. Bruce Braley is no longer in the picture. Tom Vilsack, who was the governor for 2 terms in the 90s, is going to be exiting as USDA secretary and likely not going to run for office in Iowa again. Those are 3 major names over the last 20 years in Iowa Democratic circles who have to be replaced, and that will be a challenge.
Yeah, maybe add to that, I don't think either party has that deep of a bench, really, as far as who to go to after their incumbents. I mean, really, for Republicans, I'm not sure who they go to either once Terry Branstad is done, eventually. Who do you go to? You can go to Kim Reynolds, but, I'm not sure she doesn't come off as having enough experience, really, to do that quite yet.
But in 4 years. Maybe
in 4 years, but, all the Democrats had was Bruce Braley. They could run him for governor, or they could run him for the United States Senate, and that was it. It just doesn't seem that either party has that deep of a bench, so I think there's going to be quite a bit of turnover going forward.
2 more questions.
I thought it was ancient history. Illinois was the only state that had cumulative voting for legislature, and they had the cutback. They reduced the numbers, got rid of that. And you brought the subject up. Is there any possibility that we could go back to cumulative voting in Illinois? Is there any?
There's been, there was some movement on this by somebody, and it's been mentioned within the last year or 2 that somebody wanted it. Maybe somebody else remembers who. I don't think it'll happen. It's just so out of the ordinary. And, it seems to the one man, one vote thing. I don't see it happening, but I think there are some people who want it to, but I don't envision it. Well, I was just trying to show how old I was.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I thought that was, and Quinn,
He did it. Yeah.
That's kind of ironic that you were former.
The Coalition for Political Honesty, that's what he called the group that passed the petitions.
Phil, you get the last question.
Awesome.
So this pertains for the Illinois panelists. A day before the election, on Monday last week, I was reading Nate Silver's article about his predictions for who's going to win governor for Illinois. And he predicted a 66% chance for Quinn winning by 1%. Obviously, it didn't turn out that way. But he mentioned something I thought was pretty interesting, that this election kind of mirrored the 2012 presidential election. Bruce Rauner, like like Mitt Romney is this out-of-touch billionaire when Pat Quinn's this relatable guy and with stagnant growth in Illinois, much like the U.S. had. Is there anything that Rauner did differently than Romney that proved to be more successful, and can he bring that to the national level with maybe a Republican candidate with his campaign strategies?
I know this was to Bernie's frustration, but, you know, I think they kept a very close bubble around Rauner. You didn't see tapes like the Romney tape, you know, get out in the media 2 months before the election. You know, the money also, you know, had a dramatic impact. And I just think that Illinoisans were tired of Quinn and wanted a change, and so combination of those things. The one thing that I would like to do a little bit more research on is I've heard through the grapevine that Rauner had a very well put together get out the vote strategy statewide, that he had 500 people that were on his paid campaign, and I can tell you for certain Bill Brady didn't have anything like that operationally when he ran 4 years ago, but I'm just basing that on things that I'm hearing through the grapevine rather than proof, but that might have played a factor as well.
Yeah, and the next campaign finance reports will show some of that. Let's see. One thing is that the term limits thing, I think, is just one factor that showed that he was smart to be able, he threw money at that whole effort, and he headed the committee to do that. So it just showed people that were disaffected with government and his own advertising that picked apart some of Quinn's reformer image by the controversies with the Department of Transportation, patronage hiring, and the anti-violence program in Chicago that was $55 million that kind of, some of it disappeared into thin air and yielded some legislative hearings. Rauner was able to effectively attack Quinn. People were tired of the stagnant economy, so that all worked together. The term limits thing worked together. And perhaps one big difference from Romney, Romney, like me tonight, had, you know, the nice tie on pretty much at all times, and if he didn't, he looked very uncomfortable. Rauner, no matter how much you thought it was phony that he wore the Carhartt jacket and the $18 watch, he does enjoy hunting, and he did enjoy retail campaigning, and he had the big bus with his name on it, and, you know, shake up Springfield, which people in Springfield didn't like him saying that, by the way. But he actually seemed to enjoy the retail politics of being with people and campaigning, and I think that was a big difference for him, because he went all to these little towns. He may not have given a lot of notice. A lot of them weren't necessarily available to us right away, and if he would answer one question and then walk away, that's it. But he enjoyed meeting with people, and you know, that served him well. And that's a personal thing that a candidate needs. I don't know how you translate that to a party, but if you have a candidate like that, who, and you know, maybe somebody should tell Christie not to keep telling people to shut up and sit down, but because he has that everyman appeal as well, and there's a balance. And Rauner, you know, was able to put those things all together and make it work.
I want to thank Security Savings Bank, Stan Jenks, for hosting this event tonight, sponsoring the event. I want to thank our panelists for coming in. I think it was a very interesting discussion. And I want to thank all of you for coming out and braving this cold tonight to be with us tonight. So thank you all very much.